Accompanying Nick's fantastic report on universal credit, the Institute for Government's published a short briefing paper that I think most of you have on the lessons of universal credit for current and future major projects in government. And I'm going to talk through some of those lessons now, but I want to begin with some background which is important for those lessons. Universal credit has attracted a lot of controversy over the years, often with good reason. But as Nick has said, and it's worth restating this, at its core, universal credit had the makings of a good idea. Benefit system simplification had enjoyed widespread political support for a long time. The complexity of the benefit system had created real problems for the people using it. At its worst, it took 169 questions just to establish a single parent had the right to access income support. The lack of join-up between different parts of the system meant that people who were struggling to get by could suddenly find they owed thousands of pounds in overpaid tax credits. Now, Nick's report shows that universal credit is probably still salvageable, although it isn't clear that it will achieve everything that it hoped to, and it shouldn't have been such a difficult journey. Universal credit isn't a one-off. At the moment, government has 53 transformation and service delivery projects in its portfolio. They're worth £116 billion together. It's got 36 ICT projects in the portfolio at the moment, worth some £16 billion. Now, many of these projects could be delivered even more effectively and efficiently by understanding why universal credit experienced the problems that it did and how they can be avoided in the future. So from the perspective of the Institute for Government, I want to pick out 5 lessons, and there's a possibility of a 6th, which I'll mention at the end. So the first lesson is don't skimp on planning for implementation. Universal credit was a huge change from the benefit system it sought to replace, but despite that scale of change, there was underinvestment in policy design and in policy planning. There was a failure, if you like, to sweat out what the end state of universal credit would look like. Even by 2013, there was still no Bible that set out detailed operational plans for universal credit. It also failed to really engage with the people using the benefit system, single parents, people looking for work, and people with long-term health conditions early enough to really understand how the system needed to work for them. The new, truly agile version of universal credit is using a test and learn approach, is taking regular feedback from claimants to adapt the software and the programme, and as such it's far more responsive to the needs of users now. The second lesson is beware overload. The Department for Work and Pensions had 11 other major projects on its books at the same time as universal credit to begin with. All of those 11 projects, in addition to universal credit, involved major business change. But cuts at the top of the department meant that senior personnel in DWP were already stretched very thinly and couldn't always give, quite understandably, universal credit the time that it needed. Experienced project managers were also in short supply. Now, project management is an absolutely vital role in government, particularly when you have the projects portfolio that government has at the moment. Investments are being made in this. The Major Projects Leadership Academy is providing training for senior responsible owners, for those of you that don't know, the jargon for people in charge of big projects in government. But government needs to make sure that there's an adequate career path for project managers in government that rivals that of policymakers. The third lesson is create a culture for delivery. There were 2 different cultural challenges that we saw in universal credit that got in the way of delivering it effectively. First, the people who were making the policy were separated from those doing things like designing the software for universal credit or from working on delivery issues. The suppliers were in Warrington, the people working on the claimant commitment were in Sheffield, and the policy machine, as Nick said, was in Whitehall. But we know that policies succeed when those with technical and operational delivery expertise are involved right from the outset of the policy process, working hand in hand with policymakers. Now, this has again worked much better since the reset of universal credit, where the test and learn approach has been adopted, and as a result, the operations, software and policy elements have been tied much more closely together. And the second element to the cultural challenge was the no bad news culture that Nick's report brings out so well, a reluctance to always be honest when things weren't always on track. Now, of course, that's not unique to universal credit by any stretch, and senior leaders across the piece need to make sure they've got robust measures in place to avoid no bad news cultures. For ministers, this might mean reaching beyond formal accountability structures without sidelining them, understanding from people outside government how things really feel on the ground. The fourth lesson is to innovate, but to do it carefully. With stretched timelines and inadequate resourcing, it can of course be really attractive to replace the old way of doing things with a new technique, a new approach, a new technology. But big, high-profile projects aren't necessarily the best place for doing this, certainly not for doing it multiple times. In universal credit, greater attention should have been applied to adopting agile project management, something that the department had very little experience of. After the reset, agile is being done better with a proper plan. And finally, our fifth lesson would be build in resilience from the start. Universal credit has at various times been described as an unlucky project. It was certainly beset by a series of challenges, although how unique they were, I'm not sure. But in any case, successful projects have to be able to weather all sorts of challenges and changes in the internal and external context. And universal credit might have been less susceptible to some of that bad luck if it had had more resilience built in. So strategies for keeping senior staff in place, trying to have more consistency. At one point it had 5 senior responsible owners in just over 3 years. Or if it had had more effective and earlier external challenge, and that's something that's hopefully been corrected now, given that the Infrastructure and Projects Authority is in a much stronger place than its predecessor, the Major Projects Authority that was just starting out in the earlier days of UC was. So those are simplified versions of the 5 lessons. I'd encourage you to read the briefing note in addition to Nick's report to hear more. They inevitably focus on the challenges universal credit experienced and what's been learnt from them. But as Nick has emphasised, universal credit is a story of challenges, but not necessarily of failure. And since the reset, it looks far more likely that come 2022, something like universal credit is going to emerge. And if it does, I think that can be our final lesson. Resets can work. There can be a lot of pressure on ministers to push on when a project is in trouble. Certainly, it's preferable to invest sufficiently in planning up front that resets aren't necessary. But when that hasn't happened, cancellation is not necessarily the only option.